Heat and sunlight cut through the garden canopy as I step into the reception and freeze. The front row where my parents should sit is shockingly empty. I'm Allison, 34, and I was married a year ago. Everyone smiled, clinked glasses, and joined the celebration except my parents and Chloe, my sister. Their absence felt like an accusation that hung in the air heavier than the humid breeze. I walked past tables of laughing coworkers and Daniel's family trying to act normal while my throat tightened, and my hands remembered holding my bouquet for the father-daughter walk that never happened. Before the ceremony, I'd noticed the small things that added up into something ugly. At the engagement party, my mother made offhand comments about my weight like it was helpful advice, and my father hovered near Chloe's shoulder the whole night. Daniel, my husband, who knows how to read people better than I give him credit for, pulled me aside after overhearing them whispering to Chloe in the corner. He said, they sounded like they were planning her whole life right now. I remember feeling my smile slip. He told me what they'd said, blunt and small. We never thought Allison would beat Chloe to marriage. That made something sicken in my chest like I'd swallowed disappointment with a fork. The silence from them the morning of the wedding was deafening. I should have felt panic, but mostly I felt old, like a theater prop that didn't quite match the set. I stood at the altar, looked out and measured the missing shapes where my parents should have been, and for a moment I kept waiting for some entrance they'd planned. When nothing came, people assumed they had a last-minute emergency or a delayed flight. Later, when we posted photos and my timeline filled with cousins and friends and well-wishers, the absence of their faces felt deliberate, like a photograph with a puzzle piece torn out. After the honeymoon, the calls came. My mother's voice was tight and practiced. She said, "We never got the invitation." I told her the exact dates, the mailed envelope, the electronic RSVP confirmation. I sent screenshots. My father called twice and left a voicemail about being disappointed and hurt. When I pressed them, their story flickered. Maybe it got lost in the mail, maybe they were busy. But when I asked why my mother had told family at the engagement that I needed to tone up, she laughed and said it was joking. Their dodge sounded small and childish. I apologized for any confusion because I wanted to stop the arguing, even though inside I felt like I was being blamed for someone else's choice. Pieces of the puzzle started to fall into place only after I stopped begging for their attention and started listening to other voices. A cousin confessed she'd heard my mother gushing over Chloe's new corner office like it was a family victory. Another relative mentioned a framed modeling photo of Chloe over their mantle, the way my parents would display it like a business card. It all added up to a pattern I couldn't ignore. I was the daughter who needed fixing, and Chloe got the applause. When Chloe announced her engagement months later, my parents switched on like a stage light. They booked venues I was never offered, hired planners my mother had refused to help me find, and arranged fittings I'd only dreamed about. It felt like seeing the rules rewritten overnight. I didn't deny I was angry. I confronted them, and the meeting went exactly how I expected. They accused me of jealousy, and I admitted it but made clear the kind I meant. "I'm jealous of how you love her without question," I told them. "Not of what she has." My father rolled his eyes. My mother said I was dramatic. Saying it out loud cracked something in me, though. It was the first time I said the truth to someone who'd made me small for years. Chloe reacted like a bullet. She texted me venom-thin with fake concern, accusing me of trying to ruin her wedding and painting our parents as saints. I blocked her number after Daniel showed me the messages she sent him trying to manipulate his work connections. Daniel, calm as always, texted her back, "Talk to Allison if you have a problem. This isn't how adult families behave." That reply did more for us than anger would have. It made us a team, and it showed Chloe that her tactics wouldn't work on someone who knew how to stand beside me. My parents didn't stop. Instead, they tried to rewrite the story with relatives, calling people and twisting facts to protect their image. It only made more people look for the truth. An aunt I hadn't spoken to in years pulled me aside at a family dinner and said, "I always felt you were the one who needed praising." That small confession from someone who'd been quiet for decades felt like wind under a sail. It didn't fix everything, but it exposed a truth they couldn't erase. Their favoritism had consequences. I learned to stop trying to earn their approval. I learned to build a life where I didn't have to perform to be loved. Daniel and I talk about building traditions that are ours, not borrowed from the version of family they wanted. It's messy, but it's real and it's mine. Flashbacks flooded me as I tried to enjoy the day, like someone had opened a box of old Polaroids and dumped them onto the grass. I grew up in Lacroix, and Chloe, my sister, was always in the picture as the star. She won spelling bees, science fairs, and every award on the shelf while I watched from the audience practicing polite claps. When her modeling started in college, my parents framed one of her headshots and put it above the hearth as if it were proof of their best work. By the time she was 31, she had a corner office, a company car, and a calendar full of speaking engagements. Those wins became family milestones the way my reports card never did. I told myself then that my wins didn't need to be shouted. I studied software engineering because I loved solving puzzles, not because anyone else cared. I worked my way into a steady role as a mid-level developer at a regional tech company and paid my bills, saved for a house, and learned to fix the garbage disposal without calling a landlord. When graduation night came, my parents clapped politely from the kitchen and left me to celebrate with a few friends. When I finally got promoted, they sent a text that read like a sentence someone typed without really paying attention. Those responses taught me a quiet lesson. My accomplishments would always be measured differently than Chloe's. My mother kept a running commentary on our differences like it was helpful advice. She'd say things like, maybe if you tried a little harder with your hair, or don't eat that, you're getting soft. Those comments weren't presented as cruelty, they were framed as family concern. My father would laugh it off or change the subject, sometimes offering a weak, "We're proud of you," before turning back to talk to Chloe about her next audition. The effect was cumulative. Sorry for the quick interruption. If you're enjoying this so far, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and leave comment below. It really helps the channel grow. Alright, let's jump back into the story. Little digs over years build a shape inside you that's hard to name. A hollow that fills with things like doubt and habitually lowered expectations. Once when I tried modeling because I thought it might bridge that gap, it was a disaster. Chloe laughed when I told her later, not mean but with that casual superiority that made me feel younger. She said, "You always were better behind a screen." I took the sting and pretended the rejection felt like data, not found, move on. I stopped asking for their approval because asking had become exhausting, like trying to pull a rope someone was holding the other end of and refusing to budge. Building a life without their applause felt like admitting defeat at first, but it also slowly became how I learned to stand up for myself. When I met Daniel, a software consultant from out of town who liked dry jokes and hated small talk, I found someone who noticed the things my family didn't. He told me he liked how I looked when I wasn't trying to be anyone else and how I talked about code like someone loved it. He didn't compare me to anyone. After 4 years, when he proposed on our couch with takeout on the coffee table and no dramatic fanfare, I felt safe saying yes. His family cheered loud enough for everyone, and his sister cried because she was happy, not because she was performing emotion for a camera. That kind of straightforward response was new and terrifying in its normalcy. The pattern at home didn't change when we announced our engagement. My mother's reaction was oddly technical. She suggested I might want to tone up, as if the wedding were a product to be optimized. My father watched the room like a man waiting to cue a set change, and he whispered to Chloe that they'd never expected I'd marry first. Those small sentences were a kind of verdict, one that put me back into the old role. Once you've been placed in a role for decades, people around you will keep playing their parts unless you change the script. Over time, I did change the script, but not all at once. I started keeping a record of invitations and RSVPs because I wanted proof of what I had done, not to trap anyone but to hold myself accountable. I stopped letting family comments rewrite how I thought of myself. I picked friends who cheered without calculating what my successes said about them. And when I noticed my parents planning lavish things for Chloe that I'd never been offered, the old ache turned into a quiet, steady anger. Not the kind that demands immediate blood, but the kind that sets firm boundaries and says, "No, I won't let you define my worth anymore." Saying that out loud felt like a risk, like stepping off the edge of something familiar. But I kept stepping because the life Daniel and I wanted was built on small, honest things. Dinners we cooked together, late-night bug hunts in code, road trips with bad radio songs. Those days filled the hollow my parents had left. I still have memories that sting, and I still feel the echo of their favoritism in holiday rooms that used to be mine too. But the quieter truth I'm learning is this: I didn't have to be the golden child to have value. I could be the steady one, the one who shows up, the one who chooses peace over performance, and that was good enough for me. Meeting Daniel at a tech conference changed everything for me in a way I didn't expect. He noticed things my family never seemed to care about. The way I deadpan a joke, how I could untangle a messy piece of code, and the way I moved through a room without pretending to be someone else. He was a consultant who'd spent years in different cities, and he liked that I wasn't asking for permission to be myself. We started dating, and it felt like I could breathe for the first time in years. After 4 years of dates that usually involved bad coffee and worse sandwiches between panels, we decided to marry. The proposal was quiet, takeout on the coffee table, Spotify on low, and him kneeling in socks. I said yes because it felt right, not because anyone else approved. When we told my parents, I remember the silence that came after the news like it was a sound you could slice through. My mother's first words weren't congratulations. She suggested I might want to tone up before the ceremony. She said it like it was a helpful checklist item, not a hurtful comment. At the engagement party, the meal was fine, people laughed, and I thought we were being supported. Then I saw them huddled in a corner whispering to Chloe while she cried soft tears that didn't sound like happiness. I walked over because I hated secrets and asked what was wrong. My mother looked up and smiled too hard. "Everything's fine," she said. My father kept glancing at his phone like messages were more important than the room. After the party, Daniel pulled me aside and said, "They were talking about you like you're an event that went off script." He told me he'd heard them say they hadn't expected me to marry before Chloe, that the order was all wrong. Hearing that made something raw open in me. It wasn't about the wedding at all, I thought. It was about the idea that there is a script in our family where Chloe gets the spotlight first, and when I stepped into any success, I was being punished for stealing it. When I tried to ask them plainly, my mother waved it off like I was being dramatic. "We're proud of you, Allison," she said, but pride sounded like a line someone recited because they were supposed to. My father avoided looking me in the eye and kept saying, "It's complicated," which is what people say when they don't want to take responsibility. Daniel handled it differently than I did. He was calm and practical. "Tell them what you told me," he said. "Tell them you deserve respect." So I did in small ways, pointing out facts, sending confirmations about invitations, answering texts firmly, but nothing changed. Their behavior felt like an old tape playing the same hurtful lines. Chloe started planning her life louder after our wedding. She got offers my parents wrapped in pride like trophies. They immediately started booking the venues and hiring planners, and offering the kinds of support that had never been offered me. It stung in a way that was hard to describe, not just because of what they gave her, but because they'd denied me the same without reason. When I confronted my parents, the conversation felt like banging on a locked door. "Are you jealous?" my mother asked, and she said it with a kind of pity that suggested my feelings were a phase. I told her, "Yes, I'm jealous of how you love her," without question. Saying it made me feel exposed, but also steady. My father tried to smooth it over by explaining everything I'd complained about away with anecdotes that painted me as overly sensitive. It was familiar. Every time I insisted on the truth, they turned it into my character flaw. Daniel's role in all this became a quiet shield. He stood beside me at family events and didn't let their tone slide by without question. Once, when my mother muttered that I needed to pick a better dress, he said, "She looks great, let's stop talking about appearances." My father flinched, and my mother stammered as if she'd been called out on something she'd convinced herself was normal. I felt a strange relief when they couldn't hide behind their patterns because someone else had finally pointed them out. The real shift didn't come from shouting or from dramatic confrontations. It came from simple, steady boundaries. We began to answer invitations the same way we answered disrespect, calmly and with limits. If my parents called only to criticize, we cut the conversation. If they tried to frame stories to other family members, we corrected the record when it mattered. It didn't always fix things, but it stopped letting their version of events be the only one people heard. More and more relatives began to see both sides, and the blind loyalty that once protected them started to crack. I won't lie, it hurt in 1,000 small ways. Watching them fuss over Chloe's fittings and not call to ask about my day was a bruise that didn't always show. But with Daniel, I found steadiness. He reminded me I wasn't responsible for their image or for fixing what they had decided to keep at the center of their lives. Together, we started building something that didn't need their permission. Weekends filled with projects we liked, friends who cheered genuinely, and traditions that belonged to us. Saying yes to him meant saying yes to a life where I didn't have to be measured against someone else's spotlight. It was terrifying at first, and then slowly freeing. We planned a small afternoon garden ceremony with help from Daniel's family because we wanted something quiet and honest, not a show. I mailed physical invitations and sent electronic ones too because I didn't want the question of whether they knew to be an excuse. I saved red receipts, I noted delivery dates, I wrote down who RSVP'd and when. Daniel thought I was being overly thorough at first and teased me with a grin, "You and your spreadsheets," but I needed the proof in my hands so I couldn't be gaslit later. His sister helped arrange the tables, and his mother pressed a hand to my shoulder and said, "We've got you." That felt new, like scaffolding where I'd always worked alone. As RSVP time approached, my parents dodged every contact. Their replies were short, like they were practicing economy of feeling, so busy or need to check calendars. Once I texted a photo of the seating chart and my mom replied, "Looks nice," without adding anything about coming. I told myself not to chase them. I had stopped looking for approval for big choices, but old habits tugged at me. The anxiety didn't come from not knowing whether they'd show up. It came from the memory of all the moments when their attention had been a currency I didn't have. Daniel squeezed my hand and said, "We'll have a good day no matter who sits in the front row." I wanted to believe him fully, and most of the time I did. On the day, the garden smelled like cut grass and lemon cake. Guests laughed, kids ran between tables, and sunlight pooled on folded napkins. I walked down the aisle and half expected to see my parents standing, apologizing, making a grand entrance. Their chairs stayed empty. There was no father-daughter dance, no moment where my mother wiped a tear and smiled proud at me like the mother in movies. People assumed they had an emergency. A few folks later said maybe something came up, as if that explained everything. It didn't. The empty seats felt deliberate in a way small apologies couldn't patch. I stood at the altar and felt something heavy settle, like a long unpaid debt finally remembered. I smiled for the photos because that's what you do, and Daniel squeezed my hand like he was anchoring a ship. After the honeymoon, I got a voicemail from my mother that was all clipped edges. "We never received an invitation," she said. It came out like an accusation. I felt my throat tighten, but I stayed calm because the receipts were sitting on my laptop. I called back and walked her through the timeline, the mail tracking number, the electronic invite with time stamps, and the read receipts. I sent screenshots. I said, "Here S when it was delivered, here S your RSVP." For a second I thought the evidence would stop the argument. Instead, they dug in. My father said, "You must have forgot to post it," and my mother added, "We were hurt you didn't call." They framed it as my neglect, like I had dropped the only thing that mattered to them. I apologized because sometimes you apologize to stop the fight even if you know you were right. I said, "I'm sorry for the confusion," and I hung up with a quiet ache that had been building for years. That ache wasn't just from one missing dance or one absent chair. It was the sum of small silences, of polite claps, of 1,000 little comparisons that made me feel smaller over time. It was the prom dress my mom canceled when Chloe had a callback, the graduation dinner that never happened, the way my achievements were listed as footnotes in family conversations. Sitting in that reception with my cheeks sore from smiling, I felt all of it. People congratulated us, hugged us, told us what a lovely ceremony it had been, and I believed most of them. But there was a hollow where their faces should have been, and no one could fill it. Over the next weeks, relatives asked questions, and many of them had seen my invitations. I didn't make a point of battling every opinion, but when it became clear my parents were reframing the story to fit their narrative, I corrected the record to the people who mattered. It wasn't about proving myself to anyone. It was about making sure truth had its place. Daniel kept suggesting we build our own rituals for the holidays and futures we wanted, and I started to listen. We made a list of things that mattered to us as a couple and began to refuse invitations that came with strings attached. Saying no felt like taking a breath after holding it for so long. The apology I gave on the call didn't fix my parents' behavior any more than any single conversation ever had, but it freed me from expecting a different outcome from them. I realized I couldn't make them proud, and I didn't owe anyone a performance of gratitude that ate at me. The wedding day was both a celebration and a reckoning. We'd promised one another a life, and that life didn't have to include people who treated us like props. That decision felt hard and honest, and it changed the way I answered the phone from then on. When Chloe announced her engagement months later, my parents changed faster than a season. They went from quiet spectators to full-on planners overnight, calling venues I'd only dreamed about and asking about couture designers I'd never been offered. My mother started sending screenshots of florists and color palettes like they had suddenly discovered a rulebook for perfect weddings. It felt obscene watching them pick options I'd never had, as if there had been a list and Chloe's name had always been first. People noticed. Cousins who'd come to my wedding started whispering that they might skip Chloe's events because of how my parents had treated me. "We loved your ceremony," one cousin told me, lowering her voice like it was dangerous to say. "But they made it weird. We don't want to be part of that mess again." I didn't ask for that loyalty, but I appreciated it. When relatives asked why my parents had missed my day, I told the truth plainly. I'd sent invitations, they replied vaguely, and they didn't show up. I explained the read receipts, the mail tracking numbers, and the awkward conversations afterward. It wasn't gossip. It was me answering questions with facts because people asked. My parents did not like that answer. They accused me of sabotaging Chloe's wedding by telling family the truth. My mother called me furious and said, "How dare you try to ruin our family like this?" My father accused me of jealousy again, as if laying out the facts was the same as plotting revenge. "You're making things up," he said in that voice that always tried to stop a fight by dressing it up as concern. I told them I hadn't told anyone to boycott events. I had just explained the situation when people asked. Chloe's reaction was sharp and practiced. She sent messages full of wounded innocence. "I can't believe you attack me like this when I'm trying to celebrate." Her text leaned on family unity like a shield. I replied once and tried to speak plainly. "I told a few people why mom and dad weren't at my wedding when they asked. I never said you should be punished. I'm happy for you." she answered with silence and then with a public post with a photo of her and a caption about forgiveness and family. It read like a performance, and the people who wanted to believe it did. Those who'd watched the pattern for years didn't need the Instagram version to know what had been happening. The accusations from my parents pushed more people to take sides, which was both freeing and painful. Some family members distanced themselves from Chloe's events because they were tired of the favoritism playing out on repeat. Others stuck with my parents because they valued appearances or had long histories with them. An aunt pulled me aside and said, "I remember a time when your mother did the same to me." She offered quiet support that felt like a small island. That mix of voices showed me that the family picture my parents had worked to polish wasn't as shiny as they wanted everyone to think. I didn't want a scandal. I wanted acknowledgement and maybe an apology, but I could see those things weren't coming. So I started to protect myself in practical ways. I limited what I shared with them, kept copies of conversations, and stopped trying to guess how they'd react. Daniel kept being steady. "You told the truth," he said once, folding a towel in our kitchen like we were doing something ordinary. "That's not sabotage, that's boundaries." Hearing it out loud turned the story from accusation into fact for me, and that made a difference. Chloe's wedding plans went on without me being roped into supporting them the way my parents wanted. I declined invitations that felt performative and answered politely when distant relatives asked why. "We're building traditions that fit us," I told one woman who'd asked if I'd changed my mind. The cost of staying silent would have been too high. Saying the truth changed how people saw my parents, and it changed how I let them shape my life. I lost some connections, but I also found space to breathe. In that space, Daniel and I planned our future on our terms, not to fill a hole left by old family scripts. It was painful to watch them spend on the daughter who'd always been favored, but it was freeing to stop pretending their choices didn't matter. I learned that honesty might ruffle the neat portrait they hung on the wall, but it also made room for a truer version of family to grow. I decided to confront them face to face because the whispers and half-truths had worn me down and I wanted the story off my chest. I told Daniel where I was going, and he squeezed my hand like he always did when I braced for something hard. I drove to their house with my notes in my pocket and a steady, small anger that felt like a tool. When I walked in, my mother sat at the kitchen table arranging recipe cards while my father read the paper. They looked at me like I'd arrived for tea instead of the conversation I needed. I said, "We need to talk about how you treated me." The dinner plates were still warm and their surprise felt rehearsed. They started the way my family always did, quick defenses hidden as concern. "Are you really jealous?" My mother asked like it would solve everything if she named a feeling I had. I answered quietly but firmly, "Yes, I'm jealous, not of Chloe's job or how she looks. I'm jealous of the way you loved her without question." Saying it out loud made it harder for them to dodge. My father's face tightened and my mother's eyes flicked to the window like she was searching for an escape. I told them specific things because generalities get filtered out. Birthdays they'd missed, the graduation dinner canceled the day Chloe had a callback, the prom dress my mother spent more on than I'd paid for books that semester. I spoke in pieces because memory isn't always neat. I said, "You cheered louder for her trophies. You framed her headshot and hung it above the hearth. You asked me to diet and dressed me down when I didn't look like you wanted." My voice didn't break, it steadied. Their reactions were predictable. My mother accused me of playing the victim and my father said I was delighting in their suffering. "You've already judged us," he said, "and you enjoy making us feel bad." That line sounded like something they'd rehearsed for years, a way to turn accountability into an attack. My mother kept insisting I was looking for attention, that I liked the spotlight and needed to stop making problems where none existed. It hurt that they wouldn't hear the list of small cruelties that built up into something heavy, but it wasn't surprising. They'd always had ways to translate my feelings into flaws so they didn't have to change. I said, "I'm not trying to ruin Chloe's life. I'm asking you to see how I felt overlooked." I could feel my heart pounding in the space between sentences. Saying I wanted something different for my relationship with them felt vulnerable. "I wanted your support," I said, "not your edited version of it." My father crossed his arms and repeated, "You're jealous," as if that wrapped everything in a neat bow. At one point my mother sniffed and said, "You're dramatic," with that practiced half-pity that had quieted me for years. For the first time in a long time I didn't apologize for how I felt. I didn't soften my words with jokes or minimize my own experience to make them more comfortable. I told them the truth plainly and let it sit in the room. My father tried to cut me off mid-sentence, but I kept going, listing the times I felt like a backup plan rather than a daughter. It didn't change their minds in that moment, but it changed me. Saying the truth without a wrapper felt like stepping out of a circle that had been tight and cold for decades. When the conversation ended, they framed everything the way they always had. My honesty was an attack, my feelings were dramatic, and their choices were right. They refused responsibility. My mother said we did the best we could, as if good intentions erased outcomes. My father said this is all in the past and looked at the clock. I stood up feeling both exhausted and lighter. I had expected tears or shouting, but the lack of real response was its own answer. I walked out of their house without slamming the door because I wanted control over my own reaction. That walk to my car was the first quiet part of the day I hadn't spent rehearsing what to say or fixing how someone else felt. I inhaled and let the air fill me in a way I hadn't permitted for years. I wasn't suddenly healed, the ache was still there and would be for a while, but something shifted. I no longer felt compelled to apologize for needing honest treatment. I drove home with the windows rolled down and felt a small, defiant part of myself saying, "This is me now." For the first time, I'd spoken without folding my truth into someone else's story, and that made me feel oddly free. The rest of the family drama could continue without me begging to be seen. I'd risk the conversation and come back with my dignity intact. Her text arrived like a thumb press on a bruise, sharp and precise. Chloe sent something that read equal parts wounded and venom. "I can't believe you'd try to ruin my wedding after everything Mom and Dad did for us. You're making this about you." It was written like a performance, the kind of message that expected applause for loyalty. I read it once and felt my chest tighten, then I put my phone down and walked away. I didn't answer. I blocked her number because I didn't need a front row seat to her grandstanding. Blocking felt small and decisive, a line I could draw without drama. She didn't stop. Instead, she tried to work through Daniel, which felt like a new low. He showed me screenshots of messages where she suggested he manage me for the sake of family harmony, dropping hints that being close to a sister with a higher profile could help his career or our social standing. One text read, "It would be great if you could help Allison see the big picture." Another said, "There are ways to smooth this that would help both of you." It was a clumsy attempt at manipulation dressed up like concern. Daniel put his phone on the counter and looked at me like he'd seen too much of that kind of behavior to be impressed. "She's asking me to police my wife," he said with a tired laugh. "That's a new one." I felt angry, but mostly I felt protective. I thought about telling him not to show me the messages, to spare me the details, but he believed in sharing things plainly. He read Chloe's words out loud and then typed a reply that was short and clear. "I love Allison, I support her. If you have issues, talk to her." He didn't threaten or yell, he simply stated his allegiance. That message was the kind of steel I didn't know I needed until it was there. When he hit send, I felt something shift in the room. A small, decisive boundary that made Chloe's manipulations less potent. Her next attempts were softer, like a moth coming back to the glass. She tried guilt, then charm. She posted public photos with parents smiling and added captions about family unity and forgiveness. I scrolled past. I didn't respond to the social theater. Instead, Daniel and I sat on the couch and breathed. "We can make it funny," he said, and started miming an overly dramatic text from Chloe. We laughed until it felt like we were dissolving the tension with something less serious and more real. The laughter didn't erase what had happened, but it made it smaller and more bearable. Rather than letting the episode bloat into a fight we might regret, we did something practical and kind for ourselves. We planned a weekend away to remind ourselves what mattered. We drove to a small cabin 3 hours from the city without phone service and with a cooler of bad coffee and better ideas. We cooked burnt pancakes and argued about which podcast to listen to, and at night we sat on the porch and watched stars neither of our parents had time to notice. In that quiet, we talked about the life we wanted to build that didn't hinge on other people's approval. "If this is our baseline," Daniel said, "then I'm fine." Hearing him say it plain and steady made it feel true. The fallout from Chloe's meddling spread in small ways. A few relatives called to see if we were okay and offered awkward apologies for the family drama. Some of the calls felt performative, but others were honest, and that honesty mattered. My cousin said, "I saw her messages. I'm sorry she tried to pull you into drama." Those words helped stitch small rips in the fabric of the extended family. But the most important repair happened between Daniel and me. The episode revealed how firmly he stood by me and how willing he was to call out manipulation when he saw it. That mattered more than any family approval. When we came back from the cabin, we had a plan. Keep our circle small, protect our peace, and answer family calls with firm boundaries. If Chloe tried to escalate, we'd respond together calmly and honestly. I knew that blocking numbers and setting limits wouldn't solve the deeper problems. Entitlement and favoritism don't vanish overnight, but the stakes felt clearer. I didn't need everyone to approve my choices. I needed the people who actually lived my life to support me. In the quiet that followed Chloe's tactics, I realized how much lighter life could be when the people around you were committed to your well-being rather than to preserving an image. That realization wasn't dramatic or headline-worthy, but it was steady, and steady was what we needed. They didn't stop with cold shoulders and whispers. my parents launched a full reputation control campaign as if their image were on fire. They called relatives one by one and spun a story that I deliberately left them out to play the victim. It was all theatrical. Long lists of grievances they claimed I'd started, versions of events with holes too big to hide behind. I remember sitting at the kitchen table with Daniel while my phone kept buzzing with messages from confused family members. It felt like watching someone try to erase a stain with more rubbing alcohol. Their version of events should have stuck if people were willing to believe anything convenient. Instead, the opposite happened. Relatives began to talk back. Old stories came out in the most ordinary ways over coffee, on the phone, in texts that read like relief. An aunt I hadn't seen in years pulled me aside and said, "You weren't the only one." She told me about ways my mother had controlled wedding plans and relationships in her branch of the family, tactics that matched my experience. Hearing that felt like a small, sharp vindication and a weird kind of grief. Once one person spoke, others followed. A cousin told me his wife had felt pressured every holiday to prioritize events around Chloe's schedule. Another relative admitted they'd stayed silent for years because confronting my parents felt impossible. That silence had protected my parents' image, but once it broke, it changed everything fast. People started to weigh their loyalty to truth more heavily than the habit of protecting a polished family portrait. The story my parents were trying to sell finally lost its glossy finish. Then the practical fallout started to show. Vendors and contributors who'd been booked for Chloe's events began to pull away when they learned more about the family dynamics. An event planner texted, "I'm sorry, but I can't be part of forcing someone into an uncomfortable space." The florist mentioned she'd prefer not to support a wedding with that level of family tension. It was small at first, then bigger, like a slow leak in a boat that makes everyone notice the water. My parents reacted by calling more people, growing frantic. But their every call unspooled another confession from someone who remembered being pushed aside. My uncle's response surprised me most. He'd been the kind of man who'd stayed quiet at family dinners, the neutral figure who avoided taking sides. But after a long phone call with his sister, my mother, he called me instead. He said, "Allison, I'm sorry. I should have said something years ago." He apologized without excuses and told me he wouldn't be attending Chloe's major events because he couldn't in good conscience celebrate while pretending to not know what happened. That one small act of refusal from someone who'd held the line of silence for decades felt huge. It signaled to others that the cover was coming off. Each time my parents tried to tidy their story, they only exposed more of the truth. A frantic text led to a long voicemail from a cousin who'd been hurt, and a defensive dinner turned into a confession from someone who'd been shushed for years. The perfect family facade my parents had polished for decades started to crack in wide lines. Their attempts to control the narrative made them look smaller, not stronger. It was messy and ugly, and in its own way clarifying. I won't pretend it didn't hurt. Watching a family you once thought solid fracture around a truth you spoke feels like losing a map you trusted. But staying to fight for an image that never reflected my reality would have cost me more sleep, peace, and the life I was trying to build. So I stopped trying to make them proud. I stopped rehearsing responses to accusations and stopped expecting an apology that might never come. Instead, I turned inward toward the life Daniel and I were building, toward small mornings and shared projects that made sense. Daniel and I leaned into the small, honest things, cooking dinners without a second thought, laughing about code bugs and burnt pancakes, planning trips that didn't require anyone's permission. "We'll write our own family rules," he said one night, folding laundry like it was a declaration. We set boundaries and kept them. We chose people who celebrated without tallying favor or status. It's not drama-free, but it's real and it's ours. Accepting that my parents probably won't change has been painful, but also oddly lightening. It's less painful than clinging to a hope that never matched reality. The freedom to stop performing for their approval is the closest thing I've found to peace. I don't mean I'm happy about everything that's been lost. I just know where my energy belongs now. I spend it on moments that matter, on honesty, respect, and laughter, and on building a small, imperfect life that finally feels like mine. Thanks for watching. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next video. And drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts.